The Quran also recounts a number of prophetic stories about prophets or important spiritual figures. But it doesn't recount very much about Muhammad, which is quite interesting. If you picked up the Quran and you read it from beginning to end, you would know almost nothing about Muhammad. You would know almost nothing about the founding of the Muslim community. Right? Because the Quran is not a history of Muhammad's life. It is not a history of the founding of the community. It is revelations Muhammad receives that are responding to what's going on in his life as he goes through. But there are stories of previous prophets. And this is a list, if it comes up. This is a list of the 25 or 26. You see I put a question mark here because it's debated whether this figure Luqman is a prophet or just a sage. But this is a list of the 25 or 26 prophets that are mentioned, and for some of whom extensive stories are told about in the Quran. So if you look at this list of prophets in the Quran, what do you observe from this list?
A lot of them parallel with the Christian Bible.
I'm sorry?
A lot of them parallel with the Christian Bible.
Yes. Many of these figures have counterparts or are also figures of religious significance in the Jewish and Christian scriptures, right? But not all of them. Not all of them are prophets as well. It's important to note. So obviously, typically, Jews and Christians don't think of Adam as a prophet. Abraham's extremely important, but he's typically not spoken of as a prophet. He's spoken of as a patriarch. David and Solomon are kings. They're kings in the Quran too, but they're kings and prophets, whereas in the biblical text, they're kings whose behaviors need to be corrected by the prophets, right? So it's a different construction. It's a much broader understanding of what prophethood or prophecy is in Islam. But you will see, right? So Adam, Noah, Shuaib, by the way, whose name you probably don't mention, but Muslims consider him to be the father-in-law of Moses, who's Jethro in the biblical text. Abraham, Lot, Isaac, Ishmael, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Aaron, David, Solomon, Jonah, Job, Ilyas, maybe Elijah, Eliasa, maybe Elisha. They're not really spoken of, they're just mentioned in the Quran. Their stories aren't told. Zechariah, John, as in John the Baptist, Jesus, right? So many of them are Jewish and Christian figures as well. Yes?
Well, they also don't have any of the very significant women prophets, like Deborah, who was, considered a prophet, and Huldah,
Yes.
both of whom had other leaders defer to them.
And Maryam, right, the sister of Moses, is also a prophet. Yes, this is true. And it's generally held that certainly the overwhelming doctrinal tradition in Islam says that prophets are men. In part because they have a public function. Prophets don't just receive revelation, because there are women who hear words from God in the Quran as well. But prophets have a public mission to go out and preach a particular message. And the understanding is this is something that, certainly in the time when these people are living, right, would have been better done by men, more successfully done by men. That's the understanding. So typically, yes, prophethood is considered to be something that is for men. Right? The one possible exception is Mary, the mother of Jesus. And then only because of the way the Quran speaks about her, it sometimes speaks about her in ways that are very parallel to the way it speaks about prophets, but it certainly doesn't name her as a prophet. All right. Okay. All right, so we can see that even the stories that are told of these particular figures are ones that the names in any case would be familiar to many people in the region. And they seem to have been familiar even to the Arabs. And one of the ways that we know this is that when it tells us various stories, it'll say, things like, remember when the 3 visitors came to Abraham, right? Or when Noah did this, right? So it doesn't begin by telling you Noah was such and such a person who lived in such and such a time in such and such a place, and this was his situation. The Quran assumes a certain knowledge about, a certain basic level of knowledge among its audience about these figures. Okay. Now, I have stars by the names of 5 particular prophets here. Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. Asterisks, technically. And that's because typically Islam recognizes these 5 prophets as the 5 major or 5 most important of the prophets. But of these 5, other than Muhammad, I would say that arguably the most important prophet for Muslims is Abraham. And I was going to show you why. Okay. All right. So we have, is there a pointer, a laser on here? Yes. Is it this? Oh, I see. All right. So, thank you. So we have these 5 major prophets, right? Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. Okay. Abraham, for Muslims, does not just have a heritage that goes through Isaac, but Muslims believe that Abraham's son Ishmael was also a prophet. As you know, probably from the biblical text, Abraham, after Isaac is born at Sarah's insistence and God's agreement, Abraham takes Hagar and Ishmael away. Right? The Bible tells us that he takes them away and he leaves them in the wilderness. Muslim tradition says that wilderness is Mecca. Abraham leaves Ishmael and his wife Hagar in Mecca. But Abraham comes back and he visits periodically, and he and Ishmael build together the Kaaba. What this means is that for Muslims, Abraham has a bifurcated legacy. He has a legacy that goes not only through his son Isaac, but also through Ishmael. He has a Hebrew legacy, and he has an Arab legacy. Because Ishmael settles in Arabia, and his descendants continue to reside in Arabia. Just one second. And Muslims typically believe that Muhammad is a very long descendant, right, far descendant of Ishmael. Yes?
Does it treat at all the 6 sons of Keturah, Abraham's wife after Sarah's death, or Esau's heritage as a son of Isaac?
No, it does not talk about Esau. It does not talk about Keturah. I have seen rabbinic texts that suggest Keturah is really Hagar come back, because Abraham marries Keturah after Ishmael comes back and helps Isaac bury his father. So there was clearly some kind of connection there. So some people think that Keturah, as I said, some Talmudic sources, Jewish sources, argue that Keturah may have been Hagar come back. But no, the Quran itself doesn't mention her. And the Quran doesn't mention Hagar either, by the way. This is part of a wider Islamic tradition. It's not Quranic. Okay, so Abraham has this double legacy. And so Abraham, in a sense, opens up a prophetic era that gets divided into 2 sides from the Muslim point of view. The Hebrew side going through Isaac, and the Arab side going through Ishmael. In many ways, symbolically, Muhammad brings those 2 legacies back together. He's a descendant of Ishmael. He's an Arab. He's born in Mecca, the city of the Kaaba, built by Abraham. But also his heritage as a prophet. The 5 major prophets, right, go along this line. So he's also the 5th in this line of Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. So this is, in a sense, Muhammad's spiritual lineage, and this is more of his ethnic lineage. But they're both connected in Muhammad. And there are many other important connections between Abraham and Muhammad. First of all, yes, go ahead.
Media and scholars often talk about Arabs as people who speak Arabic. That's
Yes.
Language is the acid test, but
Yeah.
and that's always been an uneasy definition for me. And when you look at something like this, do you think we can have a movement, or maybe there's always already a movement to actually talk about Arabs as something that's genealogical as well as cultural and not necessarily just linguistic?
I'm not sure about that. I think I honestly would I would agree that the linguistic element is important. Not to get too technical, but in Arabia there were lots of different tribes, and Arab tribal genealogy had divided them roughly into two large groups that they called Northern and Southern Arabs. And Northern Arabs were people who had migrated from up north and come down into the peninsula, whereas Southern Arabs were probably original Arabs that came from around the area of Yemen. But they all spoke Arabic, and because they spoke Arabic, that made them Arab. One of the things that when we talk tomorrow about the Quran, I'll talk about this a little bit more. One of the interesting things is that the Quran says that we bring a scripture, when we reveal something, we reveal it in the language of its people. And the Quran makes a very big deal about the fact that it reveals itself in Arabic. And if you were to take this very narrow definition of what an Arab was, you would say that this is a religion for a very relatively small group of people. But it certainly sees itself as a universal revelation. But Arabic goes wherever Islam does. Right? That's the difference, that the revelation is in Arabic, even for Muslims living in Indonesia or Iran or Turkey or the United States, right? That in a sense, Arabic goes with Islam. Some knowledge of Arabic has to go with Islam.
But also you can be Arabic and, looking at pagan Arabs, and finally, Islam comes, but you can be Arabic and Christian.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Maybe what you're trying to say is we shouldn't think about, it's true that not all Arabs are Muslim and not all Muslims are Arab. It's something about, it's somewhere around 20 to 25%, I think, of Muslims are Arab or Arabic speaking.